Subclasses in Baldur's Gate aren't created equally. And I'm not talking about balancing issues, because those are nearly avoidable. I'm talking about an issue that goes way deeper, all the way down to how the classes and subclasses are designed. Because picking a subclass isn't always the same. For an example, let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're in the Baldur's Gate 3 character creator and about to create a cleric. How much thought do you put into which subclass you pick? How much thought would you put behind it if you were creating a sorcerer? How much if you were creating a paladin? How much if you were creating a warlock? And how much if it was still on patch 7? The last question is mainly asked because I think the new subclasses are the ones that suffer the least from this problem. You might be able to see where I'm going with this. Picking a subclass just doesn't always have the same impact on the game. For some classes, the subclasses defines what you can do and what playstyle you're going to play, while other classes just gain neat little bonuses which you're gonna forget 20 minutes later. If you're not seeing the problem with it, let me spell it out for you. Some subclasses just feel the same. The worst offenders of this just have to be Warlock and Sorcerer, as both of them only gain small passive buffs like increased damage or additional hit points. And it's not because those buffs are weak, because many of them are actually very strong, but they are often situational or just because of the passive nature won't be noticed while playing, causing you to forget about them, and with that forgetting about the difference between the subclasses. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's the cleric, where every subclass feature feels like the cornerstone of the build you're running. Often you don't even pick cleric for the class itself anymore, but rather for the subclass. But how bad is it for the other classes? Well, for most of them it isn't really that bad, as usually the subclasses feel different enough. As for example with the fighter. And there are even classes where the difference is very noticeable, as for example with the wizard. But there are also subclasses where even though there is a difference, it isn't really that noticeable. For anyone who wants to know how I feel about all the classes, here is a tier list. But why do these classes feel the same? Well, the main reason is that the difference isn't really noticeable. This can be attributed to many different factors, the simplest one being that the effect is overly passive. One example of this is the level 6 perk of the Storm Sorcery Sorcerer, the Heart of the Storm. And that's even though the perk itself isn't that weak, essentially being an upgrade from Potent Cantrip, the level 6 Evocation Wizard bonus, you will still rarely notice the effect itself in combat. Another example of this is the Champion Fighter and how it doesn't really distinguish itself from the Battlemaster. And no, I'm not trying to say that it feels the same as the Battlemaster, but the thing is that every time I pick the subclass for Fighter, the decision between Battlemaster and Champion is usually made by the fact if I wanna deal with the maneuvers or not. The only builds where I really explicitly wanna use Champion are multi-classing builds which use Fighter for extra attack. Meaning that I won't be leveling it up past level 5 and won't be getting any better bonuses than the level 3 subclass bonus, of which I think Champion just scales better into the late game. But here you can also see another reason for why subclasses might feel similar, that being a lack of identity. For example, while Eldritch Knight has a unique identity as it gives spellcasting, both Battlemaster and Champion are essentially just fighter but better. This can also be seen in all of the monk subclasses, as every single one of them somewhat boils down to just punching. Even in the case of the Way of the Four Element monk, which is definitely the most unique subclass, a large part of your gameplay is still going to be just punches. For an example of a class with very good identity, I would pick the bard. Here, every subclass has a very unique identity. The Lorebard turns the bard into a spellcaster with very high amounts of CC. Swordsbard turns him into an exceptional martial DPS character, and Valabard kinda strikes the middle ground, where you still keep the supportive elements, but also gain the ability to turn into martial DPS when needed. The only two subclasses that are really similar are Glamour and Lorebard. And even there is a difference, with Glamourbard being more defensive and Lorebard being more versatile. And the last reason why subclasses can feel so similar is that the perks don't really do anything. And here I'm not talking about the same thing I did in the first point, where the perk is so overly passive that you won't notice it. No, I'm actually talking about it that the perks are so weak that you won't notice it. The example I would pick for this would be the Paladin. I know the perks aren't really that weak, but considering that the oath is only usable once, you won't really be noticing that much of a difference between classes in most scenarios. The problem here is that a lot of the Paladin's power budget went into the class itself with Smite and Lay on Hands, making it that the oath effects themselves couldn't be that impactful. But there's also another way for subclass perks to feel like they don't do anything, and that's if the thing they do is just something you don't care about. A great example of this is the Land Druid, as the only major perks of it are natural recovery and the circle spells. And while yes, being able to cast a spell more and having a longer spell list is nice, I would much rather have the shield that I get from Spores Druid. And that's even when I'm trying to play a druid that's mainly focused on spellcasting. The issue can to some degree even be applied to classes like Warlock and Sorcerer. While the bonuses from the subclasses aren't weak, and you definitely want to use them with a build that can use them, they just aren't the reason why you're playing the class. And I'm not trying to say that it is a bad thing if you're playing the class for the subclass. Cleric, for example, is a class which you're only playing for the subclass. And there it isn't a problem at all. And that's because in Cleric's case, the whole identity of the class depends on the subclass, while Sorcerer on the other hand already has its own identity, which is completely ignored by the subclasses. To explain, when playing Sorcerer, you are usually using it for the meta magic, so that you can cast more powerful magic. But the subclasses give you completely new effects, which would just as well work without the Sorcerer class. And this also lets us transition into how these problems could have been avoided in the subclass design. And before you scream at me, I know it was adapted from D&D, but I still think it's fun to talk about hypotheticals, and even if you can't apply it to Baldur's Gate, it can be applied to D&D. And the first way to avoid this problem is by making the subclass interact with the main class features. The best example for this is the Barbarian, as all of the subclasses interact with his rage. Wild Heart lets you pick between a variety of supportive effects. Wild Magic just gives you a random bonus effect. Berserker makes you a great DPS in melee combat and as a thrower, and Giant Barbarian just makes you a great thrower. All of these subclasses just give you very unique effects and nearly never overlap in their roles. Another great example for this is the new Sorcerer subclass, the Shadow Sorcerer. And that's even though the role doesn't change here, as it is still just a spellcaster. Instead, this subclass enables a unique playstyle with Eyes of the Dark Darkness and the Hound of Omens, with both of these abilities interacting with sorcery points, which none of the other subclasses do. The other way to make the subclasses feel unique is by designing them with a unique playstyle in mind. Here I'm going to start off with a negative example of how you should not do it, that being the Warlock subclasses, or at least the original 3. As all of them just end up in one of the two playstyles this subclass had, which by the way isn't even dictated by the subclasses but instead by the pact. And it doesn't help that all of the effects the subclasses give can be used for any of the two playstyles. But on the other side there's the new subclass, the Hexblade. While not being as much better as one might hope, as it is still just the Pact of the Blade playstyle, it does at least give you a unique spin on the playstyle with Curse of the Hexblade and the Spectres. But by far the best example for a class that does this is the Cleric, because here every single subclass has its own identity. You want someone who can deal damage while still being supportive, here's the Fire Cleric. You want someone who can make your tank literally immortal, here's the Life Cleric. You want to show the sorcerer how lightning magic should really work, here's the Thunder Cleric. And while yes, a large part of the reason why this works so well is because the cleric's playstyle depends entirely on its subclass, it just isn't the reason why these subclasses feel so unique. For example, if you took away Channel Divinity, most of the subclasses would still feel more unique than the sorcerer ones. But why does it work so well? Well, every single subclass enhances a different way of how the cleric can be played, and sometimes they even open up new ways. Additionally, most of the effects you gain aren't just passives, but instead are new reactions or actions, making you actively interact with the subclass features and making you more aware of them existing. With this, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe, and bye!